The first punch never landed. Darius Cole caught the man's fist mid-air bare hand. No flinch, no hesitation, then looked him dead in the eye and said, quietly enough that only that man could hear it, "You picked the wrong day." 6 men, 8 seconds, and a single father in a grease-stained work shirt who walked into that parking lot just trying to get home in time to make his daughter dinner. Nobody knew who he really was. Not even the Hells Angels until they started digging. What they found changed everything. Drop a comment with your city. I want to see how far this story travels. And if it hits you, subscribe. You won't want to miss what comes next. He caught the fist. That was the part nobody talked about afterward, not correctly. Anyway, people said he took down 6 guys. People said he went crazy on them. One guy who'd been pumping gas 30 feet away told his brother-in-law that it looked like something out of a movie. But the truth was quieter than that. And somehow, because of that, it was worse. Darius Cole didn't go crazy. He didn't lose his temper. He didn't fight, scared, or angry, or trying to prove something to themselves. He just stopped it, the way you'd stop a door from slamming. Clean, efficient, like he'd done it 1,000 times before. Because he had. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. That Tuesday afternoon started the way most of Darius's days started, with a list. Not a written list. He'd stopped writing things down years ago, back when Lily was 3, and he'd realized that if he put anything on paper, he'd spend 20 minutes looking for the paper. The list lived in his head now. Ordered timed practical, 6:47 a.m. Packer lunch. Turkey on whole wheat, no mustard. Apple slices, not a whole apple, because she still didn't like biting onto holes, and he'd stopped arguing about it. Juice box, 2 cookies. The second cookie was technically against the school's nutrition policy, but Darius had decided early in his single fatherhood career that some battles weren't worth fighting. 7:15 a.m. Drop Lily at school. Wait until she was inside the building, not just at the door, so inside. There was a difference, and he knew it. And she knew he knew it, which meant she'd given up rolling her eyes about it somewhere around the 3rd grade. 7:40 a.m. Get to the shop before Raymond unlocked the front bay. Raymond Hayes was 63 years old, had owned the shop for 21 of those years, and still acted personally offended every time Darius beat him in. It was a small thing, being first, but small things mattered when you were trying to build a life from scratch. Then work. 8, 9, sometimes 10 hours. Then pick Lily up from aftercare, or from her friend Maya's house, or on the days when everything went sideways from the school's front office, where Miss Patterson would be waiting with a look that was equal parts sympathy and mild judgment. Then dinner, homework, shower, bedtime routine that had somehow, over the years, evolved from a 10-minute thing into a 40-minute production, involving at least 2 chapters of whatever book they were reading together. A glass of water that absolutely had to be cold, and one question, always one, that Lily would save up all day just to ask him right when he was about to turn off the light. "Dad," she'd said last night, staring at the ceiling, "do you think brave people know they're brave? Or do they just do it and figure it out later?" He'd thought about that for a moment, longer than she expected. Probably the second one, he'd said. She'd nodded, satisfied, and closed her eyes. He'd sat in the hallway outside her room for another 10 minutes, in the dark, thinking about how she always managed to ask the exact question he'd been carrying around without realizing it. The shop was called Hayes Automotive and Cycle Repair, which Raymond had always said was a mouthful but refused to change because it tells people exactly what we do, and I'm not paying a marketing guy $500 to make it shorter. It sat on the edge of town, where the commercial strip thinned out and turned into a stretch of auto parts stores and a tire place, and, inexplicably, a Vietnamese restaurant that had been there since 1987 and made the best pho Darius had ever eaten. He went there on Fridays. It was the only restaurant he went to regularly. It was the only luxury he allowed himself that wasn't directly connected to Lily. He'd been working for Raymond for 6 years now. Before that, and this was the part that nobody in town knew, the part that Darius had never volunteered and had, on the 2 or 3 occasions when someone came close to asking, quietly redirected the conversation away from before the shop, before Clearfield, before this version of himself, There had been a different life entirely. He didn't think about it constantly. That was something people got wrong about men who'd done what he'd done. They assumed you must be haunted by it, must be replaying it every night, must be some kind of walking wound. Some men were. He'd known those men. He understood them. But Darius had made a different choice. Not because he'd processed everything perfectly. Not because he was stronger than those men, or healthier, or more evolved. He'd made the choice because Lily needed a father who was present, and being present meant deciding, every single morning, that the man who existed right now in this kitchen, packing this lunch, in this life was the man that mattered. The past was real. The past had shaped him. But the past didn't get to run the morning. Raymond knew something. Not the specifics. Darius had never told him the specifics, but Raymond was 63 and had grown up in a family of veterans and had spent 2 decades watching men walk through his shop door carrying different kinds of weight. He'd looked at Darius on the first day and said, "Simply, I don't ask. You don't have to explain. We'll figure out if you can actually fix things." Darius had fixed things. Raymond had never asked. They had built, in this way, something that functioned like friendship without ever having discussed it directly. The Tuesday in question started like any other. Darius was in the middle of a clutch job on a 9 Harley Road King when Raymond appeared in the doorway between the front office and the bay, holding a printed email and squinting at it the way he squinted at anything that came from a screen. "You know anything about computerized throttle bodies?" Raymond asked. "On what?" "New BMW. Customers bringing it in Thursday." "A little." Raymond waited. "I can learn the rest tonight," Darius said. "That's what I figured." Raymond disappeared back into the office. This was how most of their conversations went. Raymond asked questions that were really just checks, not because he doubted Darius, but because he'd learned that the only way Darius admitted he didn't know something was if you made space for it. If you asked too directly, Darius would just say, "I'll handle it," and then stay until 9 o'clock making sure it was handled. Raymond had learned to make space. By 3:30 that afternoon, Darius was cleaning up, running through the second half of his mental list. Lily got out of aftercare at 4. He had 22 minutes. He needed to stop for milk. They were out. He'd noticed that morning, and the gas light on the truck had been on since yesterday, which meant he'd been playing the odds and needed to stop being an idiot about it. There was a convenience store and gas station on Route 9, 8 minutes from the shop, 11 minutes from the school. It was the right stop. He locked up his tools, washed his hands, said goodbye to Raymond, and got in the truck. He had his phone on the seat. No missed calls yet. He pulled out of the lot and headed toward Route 9. He heard them before he saw them. That was always how it happened. In his experience, you heard trouble before saw it. If you were paying the right kind of attention, which most people weren't. Because most people had trained themselves, over the course of their comfortable lives, to hear conflict as background noise. Something happening over there. To someone else, not my problem. Tune it out. Darius had never been able to do that. He'd tried in the early years after he came home. He'd tried to be a normal person who heard shouting in a parking lot and thought drunk guys and kept walking. He'd tried to be someone who could compartmentalize, could categorize the sounds of the world into relevant and irrelevant. It hadn't worked. It never worked. Not because he was heroic, he'd stopped thinking of himself that way a long time ago, but because his brain had been rewired by years of training to read the sound of conflict the way a doctor reads a heartbeat. Involuntarily, automatically. The way you can't unknow how to read once you know how to read. He pulled into the Route 9 station and heard it immediately. Raised voices. The particular cadence of men who were not arguing, men who were performing. Who were doing the thing people do when they want witnesses, but not interference. When they want an audience for the power they're demonstrating. He got out of the truck. Around the side of the building. In the parking area where the air pumps and the ice machine were. He saw them. 6 men. Youngish mid-20s to early 30s. He assessed, without thinking about assessing. Positioned in a loose semicircle around a single figure. The single figure was older, heavy through the chest, wearing the kind of weathered leather that took years to earn. He was sitting against his motorcycle, a big touring bike. Well-maintained, the kind a man who'd ridden hard for decades chose, because he trusted it. And there was blood at his temple, and his right hand was pressed against his ribs in the way people press their ribs when they hurt but don't want to show it. The 6 men were not armed, he could see that. Or rather, they might have had weapons on them, but nothing was drawn. Nothing was visible, and the way they were standing told him they hadn't expected to need anything more than numbers and noise. This was theater. Violent theater. But theater, the leader. There's always a leader, always the one doing the talking, while the other's project was a broad man with a shaved head and a chain around his neck, wearing a basketball jersey despite the October chill. He was leaning down toward the older man, saying something Darius couldn't fully hear yet, and laughing. People at the gas pumps were watching. 2 women near the entrance had stopped walking. A man in a silver sedan sat with his window down, watching through his side mirror. Nobody was moving toward the situation. Darius had seen this exact thing 100 times, maybe literally. The math of human behavior in moments like this was depressingly consistent. The more people who witnessed something, the less any individual felt responsible for intervening. Everyone was waiting for someone else. Everyone had decided that this was something happening over there. He checked his phone out of habit. 3 missed calls, all from Lily's school. His stomach dropped. Not in panic, he'd learned to distinguish between the feeling of danger and the feeling of disruption, but in that specific parental way where the world suddenly narrows to one sharp point. My daughter needs me. He stood there for a moment. 2 seconds, maybe 3. He thought about Lily waiting, about the front office, about Ms. Patterson, with her sympathetic, judgmental look. He thought about the older man on the ground, pressing his hand against his ribs. He thought about something his wife, Claire, had said to him once, not in a serious moment. Not in one of the conversations they'd had about his service or his past or the life they were building. She'd said it in the kitchen, offhand, while Lily was in the other room doing something 4-year-olds do. She's going to learn more from what you actually do than from anything you tell her. He put his phone in his pocket, and he walked forward, back away from him. His voice was level, not loud, not aggressive. The tone he used was the tone of a man who was accustomed to being listened to in situations where people were not predisposed to listen, which is a very particular tone. And if you've heard it, you know it immediately. And if you haven't, the sound of it does something to your nervous system that you can't quite name. The 6 men turned. The leader, Trent, though Darius didn't know his name yet, looked at him the way men like Trent always looked at men like the current version of Darius. Mechanic's shirt, worn jeans, work boots, no jewelry, no visible gang affiliation, no obvious physical threat beyond the size of him, which was considerable, but which men like Trent always discounted, because men like Trent made decisions about danger based on surface characteristics, and men like Darius had spent years learning how to have no surface characteristics worth reading. Trent smiled. You serious right now? Back away from him, Darius said again. Exactly the same tone. Exactly the same volume. Man, get out of here. Trent waved a hand. Dismissive. The way you'd wave off a cat that walked into the room. This is none of your business. Walk away. I'm not going to do that. Trent turned fully to face him now. Behind him, the other 5 shifted small movements, the kind of unconscious repositioning that happened when a group recalculated. Some of them were looking at each other. One of them, the one at the far left, younger than the others, wearing a red hoodie, was looking at his shoes. That one's already done, Darius noted. He won't be a problem. You got kids? Trent asked. And there was something different in his voice now, something that wanted to be menace, but was actually just bravado wearing a trench coat. You got a family? Because you're about to make a real bad decision for them. Darius didn't answer that. Because here's the thing about that question, it's designed to introduce fear, to make you think about what you have to lose, to make your priorities compete with each other until you decide that you can live with walking away. It works on most people. It works because most people are not separating out the threat from the performance. Because most people hear your family and feel it in their chest instead of processing it as a tactical move. Darius heard it for what it was. Last chance, he said. Walk away. Trent looked back at his crew, grinning. Then he turned around and swung. And here is where the story the one people told afterward. The one that got passed around and distorted, and eventually turned into something close to legend. Here is where it actually happened. Darius's right hand came up. Not in a defensive panic, not in a reflex, with complete intention. He caught Trent's fist, in the way you catch something you saw coming from a long way off. Because he'd read the shoulder drop and the weight shift and the 3 inches of telegraphing that Trent probably thought he was hiding, but wasn't. He held Trent's fist in his hand, held it, like it was nothing, like he'd just picked something up off a shelf, and then he looked Trent directly in the eyes. "You picked the wrong day," he said. Then things moved very quickly. Not violently, not with anger. What Darius did in the next several seconds was less like a fight and more like a very fast, very deliberate rearrangement of the situation. He controlled Trent's momentum and used it turned him, took him off his feet without throwing him, put him on the ground in a way that was firm and decisive and very specifically not injurious, contained. Then he addressed the others. He moved in a pattern not wild, not aggressive, not forward-leaning. That communicatum pavrimanminasum processed almost subconsciously before their brains caught up. The man in front of them was not scared, was not performing, was operating from a place so far past what they were prepared for that the normal calculations they made, I can take this guy. There are 5 of us. He'll back down, simply did not apply. 2 of them stepped back. One of them, a tall one in the middle, raised his hands. Not in surrender. In the universal gesture of I'm done. I was never really in, I was just here. The other 2 looked at Trent, still on the ground, processing. And Trent, to his credit or discredit, depending on how you looked at it, was lying there with his cheek against the asphalt, and he was looking up at Darius, and whatever he'd expected to feel right now. Confusion, wasn't it? But confusion was what was on his face. 8 seconds. The man in the red hoodie had walked to the edge of the parking lot and was sitting on the curb with his head in his hands. The crowd that had been carefully not watching was now, to a person, watching. Darius turned to the older man against the motorcycle. "Can you stand?" The man looked up at him. His eyes were sharp despite the blood at his temple, despite the hand at his ribs. The eyes of a man who'd been in hard situations before and was currently trying to understand the nature of this one. "Yeah," the man said. "Yeah." Darius helped him up. The older man winced, steadied, set his weight. He looked at Darius. Then he looked at Trent, still on the ground, and the others who'd scattered to various distances. Then he looked back at Darius. "Who the hell are you?" he said. Darius heard sirens at the edge of his awareness. Someone had called 911 probably, from the minute it started. Probably multiple people just from a comfortable distance where they could call without having to do anything. "My name's Darius," he says Ed. He looked at his watch. "Lily. I need to make a phone call," he said. And he was already stepping away, pulling out his phone, dialing the school's number. "Are you all right for a minute?" The older man stared at him like he'd said something in a language that technically made sense, but that he needed a moment to translate. "Yeah," the man said, again. Slower this time. "Yeah, I'm all right." The school secretary told him. Miss Patterson had already called Lily's aftercare and she was fine. There'd been a misunderstanding about pickup time. Lily thought it was a short day and could he come by when he got a chance? Not urgent. Not urgent, he exhaled. He stood in the parking lot of a Route 9 convenience store while a 60-something man in battered leather rubbed the blood from his temple. And police cruisers turned in from the road. And he exhaled and thought about his daughter sitting in aftercare eating that cookie that was technically against the school nutrition policies. And he felt, for a moment, the full impossible weight of what it meant to be one person trying to do 2 different kinds of right thing at the same time. He put his phone in his pocket. A hand landed on his shoulder, the older man, the one he'd helped up. Up close, the man was larger than he'd seemed on the ground, and his eyes, clear now and direct, held the particular quality of someone used to being read by others and reading them in return. "Victor Reynolds," the man said. He extended his hand. Not a shaken offering. Something that meant something. Darius shook it. "Darius Cole. You just stood up for a stranger," Victor Reynolds said. "With 6 men. Alone. He paused. And then the first thing you did was call your kid. Darius didn't have anything to add to that. You got somewhere you gotta be? Victor asked. School, Darius said. Then dinner homework. Regular Tuesday. Victor looked at him for a long moment. The sirens were loud now. The cruisers pulling in, officers getting out, the scene beginning its transformation into paperwork and statements, and the bureaucracy of aftermath. Regular Tuesday, Victor repeated, like he was testing the words. Yes, sir. Victor nodded slowly. Like something had been confirmed that he'd been wondering about for a while, but hadn't expected to find here, in a gas station parking lot on Route 9, from a man in a mechanic's shirt who caught a punch barehanded and then immediately wanted to go make his daughter dinner. All right, Darius Cole, Victor said. I'm going to need a statement from you. So am I the police. I know. After that, Victor paused. I'd like to know more about you. There's not much to know. Victor looked at him with those clear, direct eyes. I don't think that's true, he said. The statement took 40 minutes. The officer was thorough and professional, and kept asking Darius to slow down and be more specific about exactly where he was standing in relation to the victim when the first contact occurred. And Darius kept answering patiently, because he understood that this was the job. That thoroughness was the job. That the officer wasn't trying to make it difficult. He was just trying to get it right. When it was over, Darius drove to the school. Lily was in the aftercare room, sitting at a table with her friend Maya, working on something that appeared to be a drawing of a horse, with an extremely large head. She looked up when Darius came in, and her face did the thing. It did the small, complicated thing. Part relief and part irritation and part something she was too young to name, which was the feeling of having been worried about something and being angry at yourself for having been worried, which adults spent their whole lives trying to manage and kids just expressed directly on their faces. You're late, she said. I know, I'm sorry. Were you at the shop? He paused. I stopped on the way, he said. For milk, among other things. She studied him. She was always studying him, always trying to read the space between what he said and what he meant, which she'd inherited from her mother and which was going to serve her extremely well in life and was currently, in her 10th year, something he was still learning to navigate. Are you okay? She asked. I'm fine. You look I'm fine. Lily. She looked at him for another second. Then she looked at her drawing. Then she started gathering her things. There was a thing, she said, conversationally, packing her pencils. Today, in the cafeteria, Brendan Kowalfus saying stuff to James about his sneakers, just being mean about it. For no reason. Darius waited. I told him to stop, Lily said. What did he say? He said. Mind your own business. She zipped her bag. So I told him that when someone's being mean to someone else right in front of you, it is your business, she said it matter-of-factly. Not proud. Not performing. Just stating what had happened and what she'd said. The way you'd describe the order of operations in a math problem. Darius put his hand on her shoulder. That was right, he said. Miss Patterson talked to both of us. A pause. Brendan had to apologize. Good. Lily stood up, bag on her shoulder, horse drawing rolled under her arm. She looked up at him, and there it was again. That thing in her eyes. The question she was already carrying. Dad, yeah. That thing I asked you last night. About brave people. He waited. I think maybe, she said carefully, the reason they don't know they're brave is because they're not thinking about themselves. They're thinking about the other person. He looked at his daughter. When did you get so smart? He said. I've always been this smart. She headed for the door. You've just been too busy to notice. He followed her out to the truck. And somewhere behind them, on Route 9, Victor Ironhawk Reynolds was being loaded into an ambulance for observation, pressing his bruised ribs and asking the paramedic if there was any way to find out more about the man who'd caught Trent Walker's fist like he was picking fruit off a tree and then went to pick up his kid. The paramedic said he didn't know. Victor said he'd find out. That evening, Darius made dinner. Spaghetti, because it was a Tuesday, and Tuesday was spaghetti. This had been established so long ago that neither of them could remember who started it, which was the kind of thing that felt like continuity, like a line stitched through time. They ate and talked about the horse drawing, which Lily explained was part of our project about animals native to North America. The horse, she informed him, was technically not native to North America. It had been reintroduced by Spanish explorers, but she decided to include it anyway because its history on this continent was complex and interesting, and she thought that deserved acknowledgement. That's good thinking, Darius said. I know. He washed the dishes. She finished her homework. They read 2 chapters of the book. They were working through an adventure story about a girl who discovered her grandmother had been a spy, which Lily had strong opinions about in terms of plot logic, and she drank her cold glass of water and asked Mart one end-of-day question. Dad, she said, staring at the ceiling. If you knew something about yourself that other people didn't know, something important, would you ever tell anyone? He was quiet for a moment. Maybe, he said. If it mattered. If it would help someone. What if it scared people? The truth sometimes does. She nodded slowly. Processing, I think, she said, that the things people don't say about themselves are usually more important than the things they do say. He turned off the light. Good night, Lily. Good night, Dad. He sat in the hallway. Through the thin wall, he could hear her breathing slow and even out. He sat there in the dark and thought about the parking lot and the 6 men and Victor Reynolds' eyes and the 40-minute statement and his daughter standing up for a kid in the cafeteria because she'd decided it was her business. He thought about the question she'd asked. If you knew something about yourself that other people didn't know, he'd been carrying it for 6 years. 7. If you counted the year after Claire died when he'd moved here and started over and decided that the man he'd been, the things he'd done, the places he'd gone, the weight he carried belonged to a version of him that didn't need to exist in this town, in this life, in his daughter's understanding of who her father was. He'd built the mechanic, built the simple man, built the quiet routine, and the Tuesday spaghetti, and the 2 cookies in the lunchbox, and the reading before bed. And for 6 years, nobody had looked at him closely enough to see anything else. One afternoon on Route 9 had changed that. Not because of what he'd done. He'd done those things before, in places most people never saw, under circumstances that made a parking lot look like a misunderstanding. But because of who was watching now, and who was going to start asking questions. Victor Reynolds would ask questions. He'd seen that in the man's eyes, the particular intelligence of someone accustomed to reading people, to understanding that what you see on the surface is a door, not the room behind it. Darius sat in the hallway and let himself feel, briefly, the discomfort of being seen, of knowing that the door he'd carefully kept was now being looked at from the outside by someone with the resources and the inclination to try the handle. Then he stood up, went to the kitchen, made a grocery list for Thursday. They were out of milk, they needed eggs. Lily was running low on apple slices. The regular things. The small, essential ordinary things. He put the list on the counter, turned off the kitchen light, and went to bed, because he had to be up before sunrise. He had a lunch to pack. He didn't know. Lying there in the dark, that 40 miles away in a hospital room, a man named Victor Ironhawk Reynolds was sitting up in his bed with a phone, making calls, quiet calls, careful calls, the kind of calls that men in his position made when something needed to be understood properly. He didn't know that by morning, 3 different people would be looking for a man named Darius Cole. He didn't know what they'd find. But somewhere in the quiet of his sleeping, something in him must have known that the life he'd built, the careful, contained, deliberate ordinary life had, in 8 seconds on a Tuesday afternoon, changed. Not ended. Changed. And sometimes that's the thing you're most afraid of. Not losing what you have, but becoming, again, what you were. End of part 1. The morning after the parking lot, Darius woke up 4 minutes before his alarm. He always did. Even on the nights when he stayed up late. Even on the nights when his mind ran, long after he'd turned off the light. His body had calibrated itself to wake before the sound did, as if it needed those 4 minutes to prepare for the day without any prompting from the outside world. He'd had this habit for so long he'd stopped noticing it. His eyes would open. The ceiling would be there, gray in the pre-dawn, and he'd lie still for exactly those 4 minutes, not thinking, not planning, just existing in the quiet before the quiet ended. This morning was different. He was already thinking before his eyes opened. Victor Reynolds was the kind of name that landed differently once you'd heard it in context. Not because it was famous, not to Darius. Not in the way that would mean anything to a civilian who hadn't spent years in certain circles, but because the way the man carried himself in that parking lot, even bleeding, even down, had the specific quality of someone who'd been in command of things that mattered. You didn't get that quality from a comfortable life. You got it from years of making decisions that had real consequences, and living with the outcomes either way. Darius sat up. He went to the kitchen. He made coffee, packed Lily's lunch turkey on wheat, no mustard, apple slices, and stood at the kitchen window, while the neighborhood went from black to gray to the particular shade of orange that happened for about 9 minutes every morning before the real light arrived. He thought about the 3 calls Victor had made while the paramedics were still on scene. He'd noticed them. Noticed the way the man held the phone, the pauses between calls, the deliberate quality of someone who knew exactly who he was calling and exactly what he was setting in motion. Victor Reynolds was not a man who made impulsive phone calls. Victor Reynolds was a man who understood that information was infrastructure. Whatever he'd set in motion, it had already started. Darius drank his coffee and told himself it didn't matter. He had to stay spaghetti to clean up from last night. He had a BMW throttle body to research. He had a daughter who needed breakfast. He did all 3, in that order. Lily came down at 7, still pulling her hair into a ponytail, already carrying her horse, in a clear sleeve she'd found somewhere. She sat at the table and ate her cereal and told him about the Spy Grandmother book. Apparently, she'd figured out the plot twist 2 chapters before it happened, and was deeply unsatisfied by this, and he listened and asked the right questions, and drove her to school and waited until she was inside the building, not just at the door inside. Then he went to work. Raymond was unlocking the front bay when he pulled in. "You're late," Raymond said. Which wasn't true. Darius was precisely on time, but Raymond said it every morning when Darius wasn't already there. And Darius had stopped correcting him 2 years ago. "Heard something happened on Route 9 yesterday," Raymond said, not looking up from the lock. Darius paused. "Where'd you hear that?" "Tommy Briggs was in for an oil change this morning. 7 a.m., said his brother-in-law was at the gas pumps. Raymond got the bay open and turned around. He looked at Darius the way he always looked at him when he was deciding whether to say the rest of it. Said some mechanic in a work shirt put down 6 guys in the parking lot and then made a phone call. Darius said nothing. Tommy's brother-in-law said it was the fastest thing he'd ever seen, Raymond said. Said it looked professional. The word sat there between them. Raymond picked up his coffee thermos from the shelf and unscrewed the cap. He didn't look away from Darius. "You need anything from me?" Raymond said. It wasn't really a question about 2 parts. Darius understood that. "No," he said. "I'm good." Raymond nodded. Poured his coffee. "BN comes in Thursday. Throttle body research isn't going to do itself." "I know, all right then." That was the end of it. Raymond never brought it up again. Not that morning. Not ever. And that the specific grace of that was something Darius filed away in the place where he kept the things he was genuinely grateful for, which was a smaller place than people might have expected, but deeper. He went to work on the Road King he'd left unfinished the day before. His hands moved automatically. The familiar mechanics of it, the weight of the wrench, the resistance of a seized bolt, the smell of old grease and metal that he'd once found foreign and now found like home, gave his mind space to run without him chasing it. Victor Reynolds. Iron Hawk. Those were not random words. That was not a random designation. He'd heard enough, over the years, about the internal structures of organizations like the Hells Angels, to know that a name like Iron Hawk was not given lightly and not held by soft men. It was a name you earned in the specific currency of loyalty and toughness and the kind of history that most men never accumulated. Why had Victor been alone on Route 9? That was the thing nagging at him. Men in Victor's position did not travel alone, as a rule, especially not on the kind of motorcycle that announced itself. There was either a very good reason he was alone, a reason connected to something private, something he'd needed to handle without eyes on him, or something had gone wrong with the usual arrangements. Either way, it wasn't Darius's business. He told himself that with some conviction and went back to the clutch plate. By 10:30, he'd finished the Road King, moved it out, and started prep on a 2004 Honda Shadow that someone had left in a condition that suggested it had been stored in a field for several years. He was in the middle of assessing the carburetor situation when Raymond appeared in the doorway again. "Man outside," Raymond said. "Says he's looking for you specifically." Darius didn't stop what he was doing. "What kind of man? Big? Older? Leather jacket not new? Looks like he's ridden a long way." A pause. "Got a patch." Darius set down the wrench. He wiped his hands on a rag. He walked out of the bay, through the narrow space between the lift and the tool wall, past Raymond, who stepped aside without comment, and out into the late morning where the October air had a proper edge to it, and a motorcycle was parked at the edge of the lot, a big touring bike. Clean, despite the dust on the highway that would have collected over miles of road, and a man was standing beside it. Not Victor. This man was younger than Victor, wider through the shoulders, with the particular stillness of someone who'd learned to hold his body in a way that communicated nothing until he chose it to. He had a beard going gray at the edges and the kind of eyes that took inventory without announcing that they were doing it. He looked at Darius. "You're Cole," the man said. "Not a question." "I am. My name's Briggs. People call me Stockade." He didn't extend his hand. It wasn't an insult, it was a test. Offering his hand would have been a social courtesy, and social courtesies were not what was happening here. What was happening here was an assessment. "Victor Reynolds told me to find you." "How's he doing?" Stockade's eyes shifted slightly. "Not much, but enough." He hadn't expected that to be the first question. "Bruised ribs," he said. "Concussion. Minor, he'll be out of the hospital today." "Good. He wants to talk to you, I know. You knew he'd send someone, I figured." Stockade looked at him for another few seconds. Darius waited, hands loose at his sides, nothing performed in his posture, just present. He'd found over the years that most conversations like this one resolved themselves if you simply refused to fill the silence with anxiety. "He didn't tell me much," Stockade said finally. "Victor doesn't usually send me places without a full briefing. Said this was different. Said I needed to see it for myself." "See what?" "You." He said it simply, not ominously, just factually. He said you'd either be what he thought, or you wouldn't. Said I'd know in about 30 seconds. Darius waited. Stockade nodded once. Something decided. "He's right," he said. "You're not afraid of me." "No, most people are. I can see why they would be." The corner of Stockade's mouth moved. Not quite a smile. "Victor wants to meet. Today if possible. He said he owes you, and he wants to settle that before someone else tries to do it for him." A pause. "He also said..." Stockade hesitated, which was clearly not something he did often. "He said he wants to know who you really are." Darius said nothing for a moment. A car pulled into the lot, the Honda's owner, probably, coming to check on the timeline. Raymond appeared from the office to intercept him, which meant Raymond had seen all of this from the window and had made the call to handle the customer himself, which meant Raymond was quietly, deliberately giving Darius space to manage whatever was happening in his parking lot without an audience. That man, Darius thought, was worth more than he'd ever be told. "I'm a mechanic," Darius said to Stockade. "I'm a single father, that's who I am." Stockade held his gaze. And before, the question was asked without edge. It was the question of a man who already suspected the answer, and was offering Darius the chance to choose how to give it. "Before was before," Darius said. "Victor would say the before doesn't disappear just because you've got a new address." Darius thought about that. "Tell Victor," he said, "that I'll come. After 5. I've got work to finish and a daughter to pick up." Stockade reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and produced a folded piece of paper. He held it out. Darius took it. An address, handwritten. Nothing else. "He'll be there at 6, Stockade said. He walked back to his bike, threw a leg over it with the ease of a man who'd been doing this since before Darius was born. He also said to tell you what you did yesterday wasn't just about him. He said you should know that. Then he started the engine, backed out, and was gone. Darius stood in the lot with the folded paper in his hand and felt, somewhere below the level of conscious thought, the floor of the life he'd built shifting slightly under his weight. Not breaking, shifting. He went back inside and picked up the wrench. He had a carburetor to assess. The address was for a bar called Sullivan on the east side, the kind of establishment that didn't advertise itself because it didn't need to. Everyone who was supposed to know about it already did. Darius had passed it twice in 6 years and never gone in. He understood what kind of place it was. He respected it the same way. He respected certain tools purpose-built, specialized, effective in specific contexts, not designed for general use. He parked the truck at 5:45 and sat for a moment. He'd stopped at the school. Lily was at Maya's house tonight, a pre-arranged thing, 2 weeks old on the calendar, and he'd called Maya's mother, Denise, who was warm and reliable and who had, approximately 5 months ago, started saying things like anytime, Darius, really, anytime, in a tone that suggested she meant something slightly broader than after-school childcare, which was a whole other conversation that Darius was not currently equipped to have. Lily was safe. Lily was fine. He had no reason to be sitting in this truck. He got out. Sullivan's was quieter inside than he'd expected. Or maybe not quieter, there was noise. The specific low-frequency sound of a dozen conversations and a jukebox somewhere in the back, but it was the kind of quiet that came from everyone in the room already knowing each other, which produced a sound like something sealed rather than something open. When he walked in, the conversations didn't stop. They paused. A half beat. The way a room does when someone walks in and the room isn't sure yet what category to put him in. Victor Reynolds was at a corner booth. He looked better than the parking lot. The blood was gone. A butterfly bandage at his temple. His color returned. He sat with the easy authority of a man on his own territory, which this clearly was. But he stood slightly when Darius approached and extended his hand properly this time. None of the ambiguity of the parking lot. Darius Cole, Victor said. Sit down. Darius sat. Victor studied him for a moment without speaking. The booth was good back wall. Sight lines to both the door and the bar, position that allowed observation without exposure. Victor had chosen it with the same automatic intelligence Darius would have used, which registered as its own kind of information. Stockade said you weren't afraid of him, Victor said. He's not trying to scare me, Darius said. He was assessing, yes. Victor leaned back. And most people can't tell the difference. I know. Because they've never been assessed by someone who does it professionally. Victor's eyes didn't leave his face. Which brings me to my question. You want to know who I was? I want to know who you are, Victor corrected. Deliberately. I've already started finding out who you were. That landed. Darius kept his expression level. Inside, something tightened, not fear, not anger, something more like the sensation of a door he'd thought was locked, being tried from the outside by someone who had the right key. How much have you found? He said. Enough to know that the man who works in a mechanic shop on the edge of this town is approximately 1/20th of the actual story. Victor folded his hands on the table. Military. Rescue specialist. Level of clearance and training that doesn't appear on any public record because it wouldn't. Deployments in places that aren't officially acknowledged. A pause. Multiple commendations. An early retirement that isn't in any file but shows up in what isn't there, which is sometimes louder. Darius said nothing. You walked away 6 years ago, Victor said. Not because you failed, because your wife died, and your daughter needed you. The mention of Claire, not by name, but the mention of her existence, her death, in a booth in a bar from a man he'd known for less than 24 hours, moved through Darius differently than he expected. Not with grief, which was too old and too settled to be sharp anymore. With something closer to exposure. The feeling of having your walls seen from the outside when you've been operating under the assumption that they were invisible. I'll ask you once to keep my daughter out of whatever this is, Darius said. His voice was calm. That was important. When his voice was calm, it was never because nothing was happening inside. It was because he'd learned, a long time ago, that calm was not the absence of intensity. It was what intensity looked like when it was completely controlled. Victor heard it. Understood, he said, without hesitation, without qualification. Darius believed him. What do you want, Victor? Victor looked at him directly. I want to understand what I owe you. You don't owe me anything. I disagree. Victor paused. In my world, A debt unpaid is a wound that doesn't close. You stood up for me when you didn't have to, when everyone else didn't, and you could have been hurt or killed doing it. And then you went to pick up your daughter. I want to understand what kind of man does that. The regular kind, Darius said. The kind that doesn't think about it long enough to talk himself out of it. Victor was quiet for a moment. I've known 1,000 men, he said. Men who were tough. Some who were genuinely dangerous. Some who were brave in the way that some men are brave when the cameras are on, when the right people are watching. What I saw yesterday was different. You weren't brave, you were just clear. He searched for the word, like you'd already decided something that most men are still arguing about with themselves. Darius thought about what he would say. Then he thought about what his wife had said in the kitchen. Then he said, "My daughter asked me last night if brave people know they're brave. She thought probably not, because they're thinking about the other person instead of themselves." Victor Reynolds was quiet for a long time. "Smart kid," he said. "She is. Take after her mother." It was a probe. Gentle, but deliberate. In the best ways, Darius said. Closing it. Victor accepted that too. They talked for 2 hours. Not about the military. Not about Darius's past. Victor didn't push past what Darius had tacitly established as the boundary. And Darius respected him more for that, for the precision of reading where a man's walls were, and choosing not to push them, not because of weakness but because of respect. They talked about the town, about the repair shop, about Raymond Hayes, who Victor turned out to know from 20 years back, which was the first thing that made Darius genuinely laugh in a way he hadn't expected. They talked about Lily's horse project and Victor's completely wrong opinions about what constituted a proper touring motorcycle, and gradually the conversation found a different level, not intimate, not easy, but honest in the specific way that two men can be honest when they've both been through enough to know that performance is a waste of good time. "There's an old building on Mill Street," Victor said eventually. "Used to be a machine shop. Been empty 4 years. The owner's motivated to do something with it." Darius waited. "I've been thinking about it for a while," Victor said. "A space. Community garage. Maybe. Real shop. Real equipment. Place where people who need work can learn something that's actually useful. Where kids who've got nowhere to go can get their hands on something real." He paused. "I've got resources. I've got connections. What I don't have is someone I trust to actually run it." The silence stretched. "I've known you for 24 hours, Darius said. "I've known men for 20 years and known them less," Victor said. "You know this is true. It was true." Darius didn't say so, but they both knew it. "I'm not asking you to decide tonight," Victor said. "I'm asking you to consider it. And I'm telling you that what I learned about you today, what you were, who you are, that's not something that should stay contained in one repair shop on the edge of town, where half the people don't even know your last name." Darius looked at the table. He thought about Lily's notebook, the one she kept on her desk, where she drew things, not artistic drawings. She'd never claimed to be an artist, just the things she thought about. Cities she wanted to see. Jobs she thought seemed interesting. Inventions she thought should exist. And once, maybe a year ago, a sketch he'd seen accidentally, of a garage with a sign above the door that said Cole's, with people inside in work clothes and one figure in the center who was clearly supposed to be him. He hadn't said anything about it. He hadn't known whether to be moved or worried. He'd covered the notebook back up and pretended he hadn't seen it. He was thinking about it now. "Let me think," he said. "That's all I'm asking." Darius stood, extended his hand. Victor shook it, and then did something Darius didn't expect. He didn't let go immediately. He held the handshake for a beat past the normal duration and looked at Darius with something that wasn't quite emotion, wasn't quite sentiment, but was in the same region. "My people know what you did," Victor said. "They know what it means. Whatever you decide about the building that's separate, that's already done." Darius nodded. He walked out. The October air hit him clean and sharp. He stood at the truck and looked up at the sky, which was clear in the way that cold, clear October skies are clear absolute. Deeply dark between the stars, no compromise. His phone buzzed. A text from Lily. "From Maya's phone, Dad." Maya's mom made actual lasagna, with like 4 kinds of cheese. I'm never leaving. He stood there smiling at his phone in a Sullivan's parking lot. Then he got in the truck and drove home to a quiet house that felt, somehow, both smaller and larger than it had that morning. Smaller because Lily wasn't in it. Larger because something was growing inside the walls that he didn't have a name for yet. He sat at the kitchen table with a glass of water. He thought about the building on Mill Street. He thought about Lily's notebook drawing. He thought about what Victor had said. That's not something that should stay contained in one repair shop on the edge of town. He thought about Claire. He thought about what she would say if she could see this: the parking lot, the motorcycle, the booth at Sullivan's, the man across from him who held a handshake one. Beat too long because he was trying to say something there was no clean language for. He thought she would say, "You already know." He opened his phone. Typed a text to Denise. "Can Lily stay tomorrow too? I need to look at a building." Then he put his phone down. He sat in the kitchen in a house that smelled like Tuesday's spaghetti and his daughter's shampoo and the particular, specific, irreplaceable smell of a life that was actually being lived. And somewhere on the other side of town, Victor Reynolds was making phone calls again. This time, they weren't quiet. This time, he was telling people what he'd found. And the people he was telling were already making plans to come see it for themselves. Darius didn't sleep well that night. Not because anything was wrong. Exactly. The house was quiet. Lily was safe at Maya's. The doors were locked. The heat was on. The kitchen still smelled faintly like garlic from the spaghetti. By any objective measure, everything was fine. But his mind wouldn't settle. He lay on his back in the dark, staring at the ceiling, and turned the conversations with Victor over the way he used to turn tactical problems slowly, from every angle, looking for the thing he'd missed the first time through. Victor Reynolds was not a man who offered things without understanding what he was offering and why. The building on Mill Street, the community garage, the conversation structured around it, none of that was impulsive. Victor had been thinking about this before Tuesday, maybe long before Tuesday. Which meant Darius had not been chosen randomly. Which meant someone had been paying attention to him in this town for longer than one parking lot incident, and he hadn't noticed. And that was the thing that kept him awake, not the offer. Not the weight of the decision, but the simple, uncomfortable fact that he'd believed, genuinely believed, that he'd become invisible here. That the man he'd been had been buried so cleanly under the man he'd chosen to become that no one would ever look twice. He'd been wrong. At 3 a.m, he got up and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with the lights off. He thought about Claire. He thought about the year after she died, when Lily was 6 and the grief was not a wave but a constant pressure, like being underwater all the time, and the decision to leave the service hadn't felt like a decision at all. It had felt the only thing left that made sense. Like the world had simplified itself down to one clear fact. His daughter needed a father more than anyone needed him to do the other thing. He'd been good at the other thing. That was the part he never said out loud. Never let himself think about too directly. He'd been genuinely, specifically, operationally excellent at a set of skills that most people would never develop, and most people would never need. He'd saved people, real people, with names and families, in places that weren't on news maps. He'd done things in the dark that kept other things from happening in the light. And then Claire got sick. And then she was gone. And then none of it mattered the way it had mattered before. Because the person who'd made the other life make sense was no longer in the world. And the person who remained the 6-year-old with her mother's eyes, sleeping down the hall, needed him to be something different now. So he became something different. He built it deliberately. The shop, the routine, the Tuesday spaghetti, the book before bed, the 2 cookies. He built a life that was small enough to be held and real enough to be lived. And he'd protected it the way he'd once protected other things, with total focus, with zero tolerance for compromise. He hadn't expected anyone to look underneath it. He finished his coffee. He went back to bed and stared at the ceiling for another hour before finally, somewhere past 4 a.m., falling into the kind of thin, shallow sleep that left you more tired than protest but was better than nothing. His alarm went off at 5:47. He got up. He packed a lunch for a daughter who wasn't home. Then he stood at the counter looking at the sandwich he'd just made out of pure habit. And something about that, the automatic reflexive love of it, making her lunch even when she wasn't here to eat it, broke something small and clean open in his chest. He put the sandwich in the fridge. He drove to work. Raymond was already there. Not just unlocking the bay, already inside, which meant he'd been there since before Darius arrived, which in 6 years had happened exactly twice, both times involving significant mechanical problems that Raymond had specifically not called Darius about because he'd wanted to handle them himself and had failed and was processing the failure privately before witnesses arrived. Darius walked into the bay. Raymond was standing in front of the Honda Shadow, arms crossed, looking at it with the expression of a man whose medical results have just confirmed what he suspected. "What'd you find?" Darius said. "Carburetor's not the main problem." Raymond shook his head. "Main problem is whoever owned this thing last treated it like a rental car they had no intention of returning. Frame? Frame's fine. Engine's actually decent underneath the neglect. It's everything in between that's the issue." He paused. "Going to take time. I've got time." Raymond looked at him sideways. It was a specific sideways look. One that Darius had cataloged over 6 years, the look Raymond used when he wanted to say something that he wasn't sure was his to say. "Man came by again this morning," Raymond said. "Before you got here. Different man. Older, gray, big through the chest. Didn't give a name. Left an envelope." Darius went still. "Where is it?" Raymond walked to the workbench and picked up a plain envelope, sealed, with Darius's name, written on the outside in handwriting that was deliberate and careful. The handwriting of someone who wrote by hand rarely enough that it still required intention. Darius opened it. Inside was a single index card. On one side, in that same careful hand, Mill Street. Friday, 10 a.m. Come alone or don't come. Either way, the offer stands. On the other side, something Darius hadn't expected. A name and a date and 3 words. The name was a mission designation that hadn't been spoken aloud anywhere, as far as Darius knew, in 6 years. The date was the date of the last operation he'd run before he resigned. And the 3 words were, "We remember this." Darius stood in the bay for a very long time. Raymond didn't say anything. He went to the coffee pot and poured 2 cups and set one on the workbench next to Darius's elbow and walked to the other end of the bay and started doing something with a socket set that didn't particularly need to be done. That was Raymond. That was the fullness of who that man was, expressed in that single gesture. Darius picked up the coffee. He read the index card one more time. Then he put it in his pocket and went to work. The question he couldn't stop circling wasn't about the building or the garage or even Victor's offer. It was simpler and harder than any of that. It was the question of what you owed the world when you'd deliberately stepped back from it when you'd made, out of love and grief and necessity, the decision to become smaller. Had you paid your debt by making that choice? Or had you only deferred it? He thought about that through the whole Honda job, through the afternoon, through pickup, through dinner. Lily was back from Maya's, full of lasagna opinions and a half about Maya's older brother, who had apparently said something insufferable about girls not understanding motorcycles, which Lily had addressed with what she described as facts and a very calm voice, and which Darius suspected had been significantly less calm than advertised. "What did you say exactly?" he asked. I told him his carburetor was probably dirty. Darius looked up from his plate. "You don't know what a carburetor is," he said. "I know it's something that goes wrong with motorcycles when you ignore them," Lily said. "I've heard you say it 3 times this week." He paused. "That's actually decent reasoning." "I know." She ate her food. "Was I wrong? About the carburetor? Probably not." "Good," she considered. "Dad, can I ask you something?" "You're going to anyway. Are you thinking about something different? Like something changing?" He put his fork down. She was looking at him with her mother's eyes direct, measuring the specific quality of attention that saw the thing behind the thing being said. "Why?" he said. "You made my lunch this morning," she said, and then left it in the fridge. "You never do that. You're like systematic." He said nothing. "And yesterday when I came home you were sitting at the kitchen table in the dark," she said. "You do that sometimes when things are moving around in your head." He looked at his daughter. 10 years old. 10 years old, and she read him like a topographic map. Every elevation, every valley. There might be something, he said carefully. Something I'm thinking about. Something different. Different than what I do now. Yeah. She was quiet for a moment. Processing. Is it scary? She asked. A little. Is it right? That was the question. That was the exact question. Landing clean and simple from a 10-year-old across a kitchen table. I think so, he said. I'm still working on it. She nodded. Okay. And then, with the absolute maddening completeness of a child who has asked the question she needed to ask and received a satisfactory answer, she went back to her dinner. Darius sat there. He was still working on it. Friday morning arrived, the way significant mornings often did, looking completely ordinary. The sky was the same. The coffee tasted the same. The drive to the school was the same. He dropped Lily off, waited until she was inside the building, and then drove to Mill Street. He found the building. He'd known the street, driven past it 100 times. But he'd never stopped to look at the building the way you looked at something when you were considering what it could become. It was larger than he'd expected from Victor's description. The bones of it were good. He could see that immediately, the way a mechanic sees a neglected engine and assesses what's actually wrong versus what just looks wrong. The structure was sound, the disrepair was surface. He stood on the sidewalk and looked at it for a long moment. He heard the motorcycles before he turned around. Not one motorcycle, not two. A steady approaching sound, building over maybe 30 seconds, from faint to present to the full-throated rumble of multiple engines. He turned and watched 3 bikes round the corner and slow to a stop at the curb. Victor was on the first one. Stockade was behind him. The third was a woman 50s. Silver hair pulled back, riding with the controlled ease of someone who'd been doing this for decades and had long since stopped thinking about it consciously. Victor climbed off and walked over without preamble. You came, he said. I came. I wasn't sure. I wasn't either, Darius said. Right up until I wasn't. Victor looked at the building, then at Darius. Walk with me, he said. They walked around the exterior. Victor talked, not pitching, not selling, just explaining what he saw and what he'd thought and what the problems were and what the solutions might look like. The woman, whose name turned out to be Marlene, had done a preliminary structural assessment with a contractor she'd used for 20 years and trusted completely. The numbers were workable. The timeline was aggressive but realistic if the right people were involved. And the right people, Darius said, are the ones you'd bring. Some of them, Victor said. Others are the ones you'd bring. I don't have people. Victor turned to look at him. You have Raymond Hayes, who built that shop from nothing in 1999, and who has, by my count, trained 7 mechanics who now run their own operations in this state. You have whatever network you built in the years before this town. And you have. He stopped. You have the thing that be manufactured or borrowed. The reason a parking lot full of people who didn't want to get involved stopped and watched. Darius waited. They watched because you weren't afraid, Victor said. And people will follow someone who isn't afraid. Not because they agree with everything. Not because they understand everything. But because fear is contagious, and so is the absence of it. And most people in this world are starving for someone who just isn't. He said it quietly, like he was saying something he'd thought for a long time and hadn't told many people. Marlene was standing a few feet behind Victor, and she said, without turning from her examination of the building's exterior, he's been looking for someone to say that to for 4 years. Victor didn't look back at her. Marlene, I'm just providing context, she said. Darius thought about this. He thought about all of it at once: the index card, the mission designation, the 3 words. We remember this, the way that had landed, the specific weight of being told, from a distance and through a careful chain of people, that the things you'd done in the dark were still known, still recorded somewhere in someone's accounting, and that whoever was making that accounting had sent it not as a threat, but as a reminder. You were something, you are something. The choice to be quiet about it doesn't unmake it. I need to know something, Darius said. Victor waited. The index card. The mission designation. That wasn't from you. It was not a question. Victor's expression didn't change, which was itself an answer, the non-response of a man who'd known this moment was coming and had decided in advance how to sit with it. "No," he said. "That wasn't from me." "Who?" "Someone who's been watching this town for a while. Someone who was watching the parking lot through different eyes than the people at the gas pumps." He paused. "Someone who's been waiting to see if you were going to stay folded up or decide to become what you actually are." The back of Darius's neck went cold, not in fear, in the specific physical response to information that retroactively recontextualizes everything before it, the sensation of a pattern snapping into focus that had been there all along. "How long?" he said. Victor looked at him steadily. "Long enough to know the answer to the question before it's asked, Victor." His voice was calm. "Still. How long have I been watched?" A pause. Then, "Since you got here." The silence after that was complete. Darius didn't move. He stood on the sidewalk in front of the building on Mill Street and absorbed that information, the way you absorb a physical impact, not by resisting it, but by letting it move through you and coming out the other side of it, still standing. Since you got here. 6 years. Someone had known, for 6 years, who he was and what he'd done, and where he'd gone, and had watched him pack lunches and fix motorcycles, and read books aloud before bedtime, and had said nothing, done nothing, made no move. Until Tuesday. "The parking lot," Darius said. "The parking lot." Victor's voice was careful, measured. "What you did was not a surprise to the people who were watching. What it did was confirm something. And confirming it made the next step possible, and next is this building. The next step is this building." Darius stood very still. Part of him wanted to be angry. That was the honest thing to admit. There was a version of this moment where anger was the right response, where 6 years of surveillance felt like violation. Like the careful life he'd built had been observed without his consent, where the privacy of grief and fatherhood and deliberate reinvention had been quietly audited by people who had no right to it. But another part of him, the older part, the part that had spent years operating in the world, where observation was not inherently hostile, where being watched sometimes meant being protected, where the people paying attention were often the people who were on your side even when they couldn't say, so that part understood something different. They hadn't interfered. For 6 years, whoever was watching had known exactly who he was and what he was capable of, and they had watched him choose the quiet life, watched him make the Tuesday spaghetti and pack the lunches, and sit in the dark in the kitchen at 3 a.m., working through whatever he needed to work through. And they had left him alone. Because he needed to be left alone. Because the choice had to be his. It still had to be his. That was the whole point of the index card. The whole point of Victor's careful, unhurried approach. The 2 hours at Sullivan's. The building on Mill Street. The offer structured as an offer rather than a summons. Whoever had been watching could have knocked on his door at any point in 6 years. They hadn't. They'd waited until he showed them in 8 seconds, in a parking lot, in full view of people at ass pumps who went home and told their brother-in-laws that he was ready to be found. He exhaled slowly. "The people doing the watching," he said. "Are they the same people who sent the card?" "Yes. And they're connected to you." "We have a long history," Victor said, simply. "And they trust your judgment. They trusted it enough to let me make this approach." Darius looked at the building. He looked at it for a long time. He thought about Lily's notebook, drawing the garage with the sign, the people in work clothes, the figure in the center that was clearly supposed to be him. He thought about when she'd drawn it, tried to estimate the date. It would have been maybe 11 months ago, before any of this, before the parking lot, before Victor, before any of it. His 10-year-old daughter had drawn a picture of something that was, right now, standing in front of him in concrete and glass, and the possibility of becoming real. He thought about what he'd told her. The before doesn't run the morning. But maybe the morning was the before for something else. Maybe that was the thing he'd been getting wrong. Not that the past should define the present, but that the present, this present, the lunch-packing book reading, Tuesday spaghetti present, could become the foundation for something forward rather than just the shelter from something behind. "My daughter," Darius said, and his voice did something small and involuntary on those 2 words that he would not have allowed in any other conversation with any other person. If I do this, if I say yes, she can't be exposed. Whatever else is attached to the people who've been watching that can't come anywhere near her. Victor's voice, when he answered, was different, quieter. The voice of a man speaking to something he understood completely. On my life, he said. Nothing from any of this touches your daughter. You have my word. And in the world I come from, that word means something real. Darius believed him. He didn't know how to fully explain why. It wasn't naivety, he'd stopped being naive about people before he was 25. It was something more like the particular recognition of a man who had also, at some point, put everything he had behind a promise. And who knew what that looked like from the inside. Victor meant it. Okay, Darius said. Victor waited. Okay, Darius said again. Let's look at the inside. Marlene produced a key from somewhere efficiently. Without drama, the way people who've prepared for a specific moment produce things and opened the main entrance. They went inside. It was empty and large and dust-covered and full of the specific kind of potential that empty spaces have when you can see what they could be rather than what they are. Darius walked the floor. He looked at the ceiling height. He looked at the load-bearing walls, the existing electrical, the bay doors on the far side that opened onto a rear lot. He asked questions, real questions, specific questions, the questions of someone who was already building something in his head and needed the physical information to match it up against. Marlene answered most of them. Stockade, who had followed them in without ceremony, confirmed things about the lot and the utilities with a specificity that told Darius he'd been here multiple times before today. They were already invested. They'd been planning this before he agreed to it. That could have bothered him. It didn't entirely. Because there was a difference between being maneuvered and being prepared for. And what Victor had done was the second thing he'd built the possibility before bringing Darius to it. So that when Darius arrived, the possibility was real rather than theoretical. And Darius could make a real decision rather than an abstract one. That was, Darius thought, the action of someone who respected what they were asking. They were in the back of the building when Darius's phone buzzed. He looked at it reflexively. Lily. From school. She must have borrowed someone's phone. Dad. It's Lily. Don't forget, I have the thing after school today. The project thing. Mrs. Hewitt said it goes until 5. Can you pick me up at school instead of aftercare? He typed back. I'll be there at 5, 3 dots. Then, are you busy? He looked around the building. At Victor. Reading something on Marlene's phone. At Stockade. Looking out the bay door. At the dust and the bones and the specific potential of a thing that didn't exist yet but was. Somehow already more real than it had been an hour ago. He typed, just looking at something. 3 dots. Then something good? He looked up, he typed I think so. 3 dots. Then, characteristically, with the conversational finality of a 10-year-old who had the information she needed, okay, cool. See you at 5, love you. He put the phone in his pocket. Victor was looking at him. Everything okay? Victor asked. My daughter wants to be picked up at 5, Darius said. So we've got until 4:30 to figure out what this thing actually is. Victor smiled. It was the first time Darius had seen him smile fully, without reservation, and it changed his face into something much more human and much less imposing than the Sullivan's Booth version. Then let's not waste time, Victor said. They didn't. For the next 4 hours, in that empty building on Mill Street, they built something. Not physically, that would take months, but in the specific way that things are first built, which is in the conversation between people who see the same thing differently and are willing to argue about it until it gets clearer. Victor had ideas about the structure and the funding. Marlene had ideas about community partnerships and the kind of relationships with city organizations that she'd spent years cultivating. Stockade, quietly and without fanfare, turned out to have a detailed working knowledge of vocational training programs that he'd apparently researched at some point for reasons he didn't explain, and his specificity on the subject was so thorough that at one point even Marlene stopped talking and just let him lay it out. Darius had ideas about the actual work, about what it meant to teach someone a skill, not as a performance of education, but as a genuine transfer of something real. About the difference between a program that existed and a program that worked. About what young men, specifically young men who were at the particular age where they could go in several directions, and the direction they went depended largely on what they had access to, needed from a place like this versus what most places like this gave them. He'd been thinking about this for longer than any of them knew. Not consciously, not as a plan, but the way a man thinks about things when he drives past a problem every day for 6 years and his brain, on some level, keeps turning it over. He knew things about what was missing. He knew because he'd been missing some of them himself, once, and he'd found them in unexpected places in the service, in the terrible specific crucible of doing hard twist things, with people who depended on you and whom you depended on, in the experience of having someone look at you and expect something real from you, and then have the thing you gave them actually matter. That was what was missing for a lot of young men in this town and in towns like this. Not jobs, exactly. Not skills, exactly, the experience of mattering. He said this imprecisely, haltingly, because it wasn't something he'd ever had to put into words, and when he finished, the building was very quiet. Then Marlene said, "That's the whole point. That's what no grant application has ever figured out how to say." Then Victor said, "Write that down. Write exactly what you just said, the way you said it." Then Stockade said nothing, but he nodded once, the way he'd nodded in Raymond's parking lot, when he'd decided something was confirmed. Darius' phone said 4:15. "I have to go," he said. "I know," Victor said. "We'll talk about the structure, the formal stuff, how this actually gets set up." Yes. And the other thing. He meant the watchers, the people with the mission designation and the index card. That conversation isn't finished. "No," Victor agreed, "it isn't. But it happens on my terms. My timeline." Vic nodded. "Your terms." They shook hands again. No extra beat this time, just a handshake. Clean and even, between two men who had moved past the phase of assessment into something that was, tentatively and carefully, the first shape of trust. Darius drove to the school. Lily was outside, standing with Mrs. Hewitt, holding a project display board that had been decorated in what appeared to be every color of construction paper available in the school district. She saw his truck and said something to Mrs. Hewitt, and came toward him at the particular speed of a 10-year-old who was trying to look casual about being relieved. She got in the truck. She put the display board in the back seat very carefully. "How was the project thing?" he asked. "Good. It went really well." She buckled her seatbelt. Mrs. Hewitt said mine was one of the strongest in the class. Yeah. She paused. "I did it about horses. The complicated history of horses in North America. How they're technically reintroduced, but how that doesn't make their story here less real." She paused again. Mrs. Hewitt said it was nuanced. "It is nuanced," Darius said. "I know." She looked out the window. Then, "How was your thing, the thing you were looking at?" He merged onto the road. He thought about how to answer that. Thought about the building, the 4 hours, the conversation about what was missing. Marlene, writing things down, Stockade's single nod. He thought about the index card in his pocket, and the mission designation from 6 years ago, and the 3 words that someone had sent to confirm they remembered. He thought about what it meant to be seen. "I think," he said slowly, "it might be the beginning of something." Lily was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Something that matters." He looked at the road. "Yeah," he said. "I think so." She nodded. And then, with the full and generous simplicity of someone who had asked the right question and received a true answer and needed nothing more than that, "Good, Dad." She leaned against the window. He drove them home, and somewhere behind them, in the building on Mill Street, Victor Reynolds was standing in the empty space where a floor full of people learning something real would eventually stand. And he was looking at the dust and the bones and the light coming through the bay doors. And he was already making the calls. This time, he wasn't calling 2 or 3 people. He was calling 50. The calls Victor made that Friday night moved fast. Darius didn't know the exact shape of what was happening. He found out pieces of it later, assembled it gradually the way you assemble something from evidence, rather than direct witness. But by Saturday morning, the first signs were already visible. Raymond called him at 7:15. Which Raymond never did on weekends. and his voice had the particular quality of a man who was trying to stay calm about something that was not entirely calm. "You want to tell me," Raymond said, "why there are 3 motorcycles parked on the street in front of the shop?" Darius sat up in bed. "Are they doing anything?" he asked. "Standing there," Raymond said, "drinking coffee. From thermoses, like they've been there a while. Did they say anything to you?" "I haven't gone out yet. I'm watching through the window like a man in a nature documentary." A pause. "Darius, what did you do?" "I had a conversation with someone," Darius said, "about a building." A very long pause. "The building on Mill Street?" Raymond said. Darius went. "How do you know about that building?" "Because Victor Reynolds called me last night," Raymond said. "At 10:30 p.m., which is 30 minutes past, when I normally have the good sense to be asleep. He wanted to know what I thought about you. I told him what I thought. He said thank you, and hung up." Another pause. "I was going to ask you about it today anyway. What did you tell him?" "I told him you were the best mechanic I'd ever trained, that your word was as good as money in the bank, and that, whatever you were doing with that building, I'd support it." Raymond's voice shifted. Was that the right answer? Darius sat on the edge of his bed. "Yeah," he said. "That was the right answer." "Good." The sound of Raymond's screen door. "Now come tell these men their coffee break is over before my neighbors call the police." Darius got dressed. He drove to the shop. The 3 riders out front were young mid-20s. Maybe with the clean, deliberate look of people who'd been sent somewhere specific and knew how to represent themselves when they got there. When Darius pulled in, they straightened. Not at attention, exactly. But close, the one in the center stepped forward, "Mr. Cole." He extended his hand. "My name's Danny. Victor sent us. He wanted you to know he's got people available this weekend if you want to do a walkthrough of the building with contractors." Darius shook his hand. "On a Saturday?" "Yes, sir." Danny said it. Like Saturday was a completely normal day to arrange a contractor walkthrough. Which, in whatever world Victor Reynolds operated in, it apparently was. How many contractors? 3. Different specialties. Victor said to cover all the bases at once so you'd have real numbers to work with. Darius looked at Raymond, who was standing in the doorway of the shop with his coffee, and an expression that said, "I am staying out of whatever this is while being fully invested in watching it." "What time?" Darius asked. 10 o'clock, if that works." It was currently 7:43. "It works," Darius said. He went inside and told Raymond what was happening. Raymond listened with the stillness of a man who was updating his understanding of a situation that was larger than he'd initially mapped it. "You said yes," Raymond said, "to the building." Tentatively. "You said yes, Darius. You don't do things tentatively." He set his coffee down. "How long have you been thinking about this?" Darius thought about the honest answer. "Longer than I knew I was thinking about it," he said. Raymond nodded slowly. He looked out the bay door at the 3 riders, who had moved their motorcycles to proper parking spots and were now sitting on the curb with their thermoses, talking quietly among themselves, not making any demands on anyone. "Your wife would have liked this," Raymond said. He said it quietly. Not as a provocation, not as sentiment, but as a simple fact delivered by someone who had enough respect for both parties to state it plainly. Darius didn't answer. He didn't need to. By 10 o'clock, he was at the building on Mill Street with 3 contractors, Marlene, Stockade, and Victor, who arrived last and said nothing about the calls he'd made Friday night, as if they had already been incorporated into the conversation and didn't require acknowledgement. The contractors were thorough. Each one walked their section, with Darius directly, answering his questions without condescension, which he appreciated, because he was asking real questions, and a condescending answer to a real question was something he had no patience for. The electrical was more complicated than Marlene's preliminary assessment suggested. The contractor, a compact woman named Sandra, who had the focused energy of someone who'd been doing this for 20 years and had stopped caring about making it look easy, walked Darius through the panel situation and explained what was needed in plain language that added up to a real number. The structural was mostly sound, the way he'd assessed from the outside. A few areas needed attention, and the contractor pointed them out with the same unadorned precision. The plumbing was the smallest problem, which was a relief. By noon, they had real numbers. Not final numbers, but real ones, the kind you could actually build a plan around. Darius sat in the middle of the empty floor with a legal pad that Marlene had produced and worked through what he was looking at. The number was large, but it was not impossible. And the difference between large and impossible was something Darius had learned to take seriously, because most of what he'd done in his life had looked impossible from the outside until it wasn't. "Victor," he said. Victor came over, sat on a stack of something lumber samples the contractor had left with the ease of a man who had never in his life felt under-dignified. "The funding," Darius said. "I need to understand the structure. What's grants? What's other sources? And what exactly any of those sources expect in return?" Victor looked at him steadily. Straight question. "I don't do other kinds." "I know." Victor leaned forward slightly. "My contribution is direct and unconditional. No expectations, no naming rights, no influence over how you run the floor. It's a gift, not an investment." He paused. "The grant side is Marlene's territory. She'll walk you through it. It's legitimate. It's clean. And the conditions are standard nonprofit conditions reporting. Outcomes tracking, nothing that touches operational independence. And the other sources." A pause. "There are people," Victor said, "who've been watching this town for a while, who have resources, and who want to put some of them here. Their conditions are the same as mine, no strings. No expectations, no presence. They want this to exist. They don't want credit." Darius looked at him. "The people with the index card," he said. "Yes. I want to know who they are. Victor. Before I take their money, I want to know who I'm taking it from." Victor was quiet for a moment. The contractors were at the far end of the building, packing their things. Marlene and Stockade were near the bay doors, giving this conversation space. "I can arrange a conversation," Victor said. "One person. The person who made the call on the index card. She doesn't meet people easily, but she will meet you. Because she already has a strong opinion about you, and she wants to know if she's right." "She," Darius said. "Her name is Agnes," Victor said. "She's 71 years old. She knew your commanding officer." He paused and let that land. "She's been in rooms that most people don't know exist. And she chose this town, and this building, and you, for reasons that I only partly understand, and that she will explain better than I can." Agnes, 71, knew his commanding officer. Darius turned that over. There were exactly 3 people in the chain of command above him in his final operational years who could be described as someone that a woman like Victor was describing might know. He went through all 3. One was dead. One was stationed overseas. The third had retired 3 years ago, and had said to him, on the last day they spoke, "When it's time, someone will find you. Let them." He'd thought that was a metaphor. He hadn't thought it was an instruction. "When?" Darius said. "I'll make a call," Victor said. His phone was already in his hand. Darius walked to the bay doors where Marlene was standing and looked out at the rear lot, which was overgrown and rough but large. He stood there and let his mind process what had just happened, which was that the shape of something he'd been told about 6 years ago vaguely, indirectly, in the form of a sentence that sounded like encouragement, but was apparently also. Logistics had just become specific. Someone had been waiting for him to be ready. His commanding officer had known. He'd been part of a plan he hadn't consented to and hadn't known about. He waited for the anger and was surprised when it didn't come, or came only mildly, tempered by something else, by the fact that whoever was doing this had, as established, spent 6 years watching and waiting and not interfering, had given him every year of the quiet life, had not pushed, had not called, had not appeared at his door with a better offer at any of the 100 points. When the quiet life was hard and he might have been vulnerable to one, they'd waited until he showed them he was ready. That was not the action of people who wanted to control him. That was the action of people who understood that this only worked if it was his choice. Marlene said, quietly, "You okay?" "Still processing," he said. "Take your time." She paused. "For what it's worth, I've been around Victor for 11 years, and in 11 years I've seen him put his word behind exactly 4 things. This is the 5th. She looked at the rear lot. He doesn't do this lightly, and he's not wrong. About what specifically? She turned to look at him directly. About what you are. about what this place could be, and about the fact that the two things are connected. He looked at the lot. He was thinking about what he'd said Friday afternoon about the experience of mattering, about young men who needed to be expected to do something real. He was thinking about a 23-year-old version of himself, before the service, before everything, when he'd been exactly the kind of person who could have gone in any direction and went in a good one, partly because someone had looked at him and expected something real from him. He didn't know who that would have been for him if things had been different. He knew what it had meant to have it. "I'm going to need someone to help manage the front end," he said, "the administrative side. I'm a mechanic, not a program director." "Already identified," Marlene said smoothly. "A woman named Carla Simmons. She ran the workforce development program at the community college for 8 years. She's been looking for something with more direct impact. She's been briefed." Darius turned to look at her. "How long have you people been planning this?" he said. Marlene's expression was composed and unapologetic. "The building has been on Victor's radar for 2 years. The operational concept for about 18 months. She tilted her head. "You became the missing piece approximately 14 months ago. When someone observed you spending your lunch break teaching a kid from the neighborhood how to change his own oil, for free, with a patience that Victor's source described as, quote, exceptional. He remembered that kid. Marcus, 17, a little lost in the way 17-year-olds sometimes were, always hanging around the edge of the shop without quite being able to articulate what he was looking for. Darius had invited him in one afternoon and shown him how to do a basic oil change. Marcus had come back twice more. Then his family had moved. He hadn't thought about it as anything significant. It had apparently been the moment someone decided he was worth planning around. His phone buzzed. "Victor, a text. Agnes will meet you tonight, 7. I'll send the address." Darius looked at the message. He typed back, "Does she know I might say no? 3 dots. Then she's counting on you asking that question. It's why she agreed to meet." He put the phone in his pocket. He spent the afternoon back at the shop, working. He needed his hands busy while his mind ran. It was a thing he'd learned about himself, that the best thinking happened while he was physically occupied with something concrete. Raymond didn't ask any questions, which was the right call. He worked his side of the bay, and Darius worked his, and the familiar rhythm of it, the sounds and smells and weight of the work, gave everything else room to settle into the right order. By 5, it had settled. He picked up Lily from Maya's house. She'd gone over after her project presentation. Apparently the two of them had a whole afternoon planned around something involving Clay and horses, and she got in the truck with Clay on her left hand, and the expression of someone who had had an excellent day and was not fully ready to re-enter regular life. "I have to go out tonight," he said. For a few hours, she looked at him. "Thinking? Part of the thing. Can Denise come over?" He'd already called Denise. She'd said yes before he finished explaining, which he'd noted and filed in the category of things he was going to have to address at some point when the current situation contained fewer moving pieces. "She'll be there at 6:30, he said. Lily nodded, looked at her clay-covered hand. Then, without setup, "Dad, is the thing you're doing the kind of thing that's going to change things? Like actually change them?" He drove for a moment without answering. "I think it is," he said. "For us, or for other people, both. In different ways." She was quiet. He could feel her processing, not with anxiety, just with the thoroughness she brought to anything she decided deserved it. "Okay," she said. "Just okay. Just the full acceptance of it." "You're not worried?" he asked. "I'm a little worried," she said honestly, "but mostly I think it's good. Because you've been." She paused, searching for the word with the precision she always brought to finding exact words. "You've been waiting for a long time. To do something bigger. I didn't know what it was going to be, but I could tell you were waiting." He gripped the steering wheel. "Your mom was like that too," he said. Which he almost never said, not because he didn't want to, but because he was always careful about how he offered Claire to Lily, giving her enough to know who her mother was, without making it a wound that stayed open. "She always knew when I was carrying something I hadn't said yet." Lily looked out the window. "I know," she said softly. "Denise says I'm intuitive." I think I just pay attention. Your mom paid attention too. A beat. Tell me something about her, Lily said. The way she always asked, not desperately, just steadily. The ask of a child who understood that these stories were a finite resource and wanted them carefully. She used to say, Darius said, that the bravest thing a person could do was decide what kind of life they wanted and then actually live it. Not talk about it. Not plan it to death. Just start living it and trust that the living would sort the rest out. Lily turned that over. He could see her doing it. Is that what you're doing? She said. He thought about the building. About Victor and Agnes and the index card and 14 months ago, and a kid named Marcus who'd wanted to learn how to change his oil. Yeah, he said. I think that's exactly what I'm doing. Agnes lived in a part of the city. Darius didn't often go to the older residential section where the houses were big and set back from the street, and the neighborhood had the specific quietness of money that had been present long enough to stop announcing itself. Victor had sent a text with just the address and nothing else. Darius knocked at 7 exactly. The door opened almost immediately, not as if she'd been waiting nervously, but as if she'd been ready, which was different. Agnes was smaller than he'd expected. 71 years old, silver-haired, with the upright posture of someone who'd spent decades in rooms where posture mattered and had simply never stopped. She wore reading glasses pushed up on her head. She had blue eyes that were, in the first second of meeting them, the sharpest eyes Darius had encountered in a long time. Not young eyes, old eyes, fully experienced, that had lost the capacity for surprise without losing the capacity for interest. You're taller than your file, she said. He blinked. My file. Come in, she said, already turning. Not imperious, just direct. The directness of someone who'd stopped wasting time many years ago. He came in. She led him to a room that was clearly a workspace, books, papers, a desk that had been used seriously for a long time, 2 chairs positioned across from each other at the angle that said, this is where conversations happen, not pleasantries. She sat. He sat. She looked at him for a moment, without speaking. He waited. I knew your CO for 30 years, she said. Colonel Michael Breslin. You knew him as a commander. I knew him as someone who found people. She paused. His specific skill, and he had many, but this was the particular one, was identifying individuals who had a capacity that exceeded what their circumstances had yet required of them. Who were, in the jargon, underdeployed. She tilted her head. He identified you at 26. He tracked your career until you resigned. Before he retired, he gave me 3 names. Names of people he believed were, in his word, unfinished. Darius was very still. Your name was on the list, he said. My name was the list, Agnes said. By the time he retired, the other 2 had found their paths. You were the one still waiting. The room was so quiet Darius could hear the clock on her desk. Why didn't he contact me himself? Darius asked. Because he understood that a man who left what you left, for the reasons you left it, needed the departure to be real. A contact from him would have felt like a door that never fully closed. He wanted you to have a closed door. A real one. She folded her hands. He said, give him the years he needs. When he's ready, you'll see it. And when you see it, offer him something worthy of what he is. The parking lot? Darius thought. Not just the parking lot. The 14 months ago, Marcus and the oil change. All of it adding up to a picture that someone was watching for, waiting to be complete enough. The index card, he said. The mission designation. I sent that, Agnes said. Why that mission specifically? Her expression shifted. Not with emotion exactly. With the weight of things that had happened and been carried for a long time. Because on that mission, she said, you made a decision that cost you something significant and that nobody was in a position to acknowledge at the time. You protected 3 people who had no strategic value by any operational calculation. You delayed an extraction to do it. You were alone, without support, in a situation where most men would have made the other call and been completely justified. She paused. That decision has never been publicly recognized. It deserved to be. That was what I was saying with the card. Darius sat with that for a long moment. He hadn't thought about that mission in a long time. Or rather, he'd thought about it the way you thought about things that had been resolved in yourself. The decision had been made. He'd lived with the consequences, and the resolution had been internal. He hadn't needed external acknowledgement. But hearing it named, plainly, by someone who knew what it had cost and what it had meant, it moved through him differently than he'd expected. "What do you want from this?" he said. "From the building. From whatever you've been planning." Agnes looked at him directly. "I want exactly what Victor told you," she said. "I want it to exist. I want it to work. I want young men in this town to have access to something real." She paused. "And I want to know, before I put my resources and my remaining credibility behind it, that the person running it is the person I think he is. And you are," she said. Simply, "you were the moment you walked through that door. The way you sit, the way you waited, the way you asked the hard question instead of the polite one." She almost smiled. Colonel Breslin's assessment was correct. It usually was. Darius looked at the desk. "He was a good man," he said. "He was," Agnes said. "He would have wanted to see this." They talked for another hour and a half. Real talk, detailed, specific, the kind of conversation that built something with words before the physical building existed. She told him what she knew about the town, the specific gaps in what existed for young people and for families trying to find stable ground. He told her what he'd thought about on Friday, about the experience of mattering. She listened without interrupting, which was a specific skill that not everyone had. When he got up to leave, she rose too. At the door she said, "One more thing." He waited. "Trent Walker," she said. The name landed hard, the leader, the parking lot, the man on the ground. "What about him?" Darius said. "He was arrested after the parking lot incident." Agnes said. "Released 2 days later. He's 28 years old, and he has the kind of history that makes most people decide he's already determined." She paused. "He's not. I've looked at him carefully. There are people in his history who failed him in specific, identifiable ways. He's angry and he's lost, and he made choices he can't easily unmake." She looked at Darius. "He's going to come to you. Not soon. Maybe in months." But Darius said nothing. "What you do then," Agnes said, "will be as important as everything else." He drove home in the dark. Lily was asleep. Denise had left a note on the kitchen table, brief, warm, with a small smiley face in the corner that he suspected had been drawn by Lily. He stood in the kitchen and read it, and set it down and stood there for another minute. He thought about Colonel Breslin, who he hadn't thought of in months, who had identified him at 26 and tracked his career and carried his name on a list and entrusted it to a 71-year-old woman with sharp blue eyes and a desk that had been used seriously for a very long time, who had wanted him to have a closed door, a real one, who had believed, apparently, that the door would open again when it was time. He went and looked in on Lily. She was on her side, facing the window, and the clay was still faintly on her left hand because she'd apparently gone to bed without fully washing it off. The horse drawing from school was pinned to her bulletin board. The notebook was on her desk, closed. He stood in the doorway for a moment. He thought, this is what it's all for. This is the center of the entire thing. Not the building, not Victor, not Agnes, not the men on Mill Street, not even the young men who would eventually stand on that floor there and learn something real. This kid, asleep, with clay on her hand and her mother's eyes, and the absolute specific gravity of a life that depended on him to be exactly who he was, not the person he'd been before. Not a performance of something heroic, but exactly the mechanic father quiet man caught a fist and then called the school that he had actually become. He was going to build something, and he was going to do it as himself. He pulled her door almost closed. He went to bed, and in the morning, when the alarm didn't go off 4 minutes early because he was already awake, he lay there in the dark and felt, for the first time in a long time, something he didn't immediately try to name because naming it too quickly would have been a kind of superstition. He let it sit. It felt, he thought finally, like the beginning of a thing that had been trying to begin for a long time. It felt like being unfolded. The building on Mill Street took 11 weeks to become something. Not finished, it would never be fully finished. Darius understood that now, because a living place was always becoming, always requiring something new from the people inside it. But 11 weeks from the Saturday of the contractor walkthrough. The floor was clean, the bays were functional, the electrical was done, And there were 4 used lifts that Stockade had sourced from a shop closing in Pennsylvania and driven down himself on a flatbed because he said he wanted to make sure they were handled right. Darius had worked most of those 11 weeks with his hands. Not supervising. Working. He'd told Victor at the start that he wasn't going to manage a renovation from a distance. He needed to understand every system in the building the way he understood the systems in an engine. Because the day something went wrong, he couldn't afford to be the person who didn't know where to look. Victor had said fine. Marlene had made a schedule. And for 11 weeks, Darius split his time between Raymond's shop and Mill Street, arriving at the building by 6 most mornings and staying until the light got bad. Raymond had given him the flexible hours without being asked. He'd also shown up on 3 Saturdays with his own tools and hadn't said a word about it, just worked. The first person Darius hired was a man named Calvin, 44 years old, who'd been a certified mechanic for 17 years until a back injury and a divorce, and a series of bad decisions had left him with a gap in his employment history that most shops wouldn't look past. Darius had met him through a referral from the vocational counselor at the community college, Carla Simmons, who had joined the operation in week 3 with the organized energy of someone who'd been waiting for a project that matched her actual capacity and was determined to not waste a single day of it. Carla had put Calvin's file on Darius's desk and said simply, "He's the best candidate I have. He just needs someone to look past the gap." Darius had called Calvin that afternoon. Calvin had come in the next morning, and in the first 10 minutes of watching him handle a socket set, Darius had known the referral was right. The hands told you everything. Hands that had worked serious mechanical problems for 17 years, moved with a specific intelligence that you couldn't fake and couldn't learn quickly. Calvin's hands moved that way. "You'll run the second bay," Darius told him. Calvin had looked at him for a moment like he was waiting for the condition. "That's it?" Calvin said. "That's it," Darius said. "Show up, do the work. Treat the people who come in here with respect. That's the whole job." Calvin had been there every day since. On time. Every day. The second person was Marcus. Not the same Marcus from 2 years ago, a different one. 17 years old. Quiet in the particular way that teenagers were quiet when they were paying attention to everything around them, but had not yet decided who was safe enough to show it to. He showed up on the second week after opening, stood outside the bay door for almost 20 minutes, before Darius noticed him and walked over. "You? Looking for something?" Darius asked. "I heard you teach people," the kid said. "I teach people who want to learn," Darius said. "There's a difference." A pause. "What's the difference?" "Wanting to learn means you're going to do things wrong and stay anyway," Darius said. "A lot of people want to know things. Not as many people want to go through learning them." The kid thought about that. "I can stay," he said. His name was Marcus too, which Darius had noticed and said nothing about. He was in the shop every afternoon by 3:30, and within 2 weeks he was no longer standing in doorways, but standing next to Calvin at the second lift, handing tools and watching, with the focus of someone who understood, already, that this was a thing worth paying attention to. By week 6, there were 11 young men in the apprenticeship program. By week 9, there were 17. Carla managed the intake, the scheduling, the relationships with the city's workforce development office, and the 2 high schools that had agreed to count shop hours toward vocational credits. She did all of it with a precision that Darius found, increasingly, was what made the whole thing possible, not because he couldn't manage the administrative side, but because having someone who could freed him to be on the floor, which was where the actual work happened. The floor was where Darius was most himself. He'd known this. He'd known it at Raymond's shop, had known it for years. But at Mill Street, it was different, because the floor was not just cars and motorcycles, it was people. Specifically, it was young men who'd arrived with varying degrees of skepticism and displacement, who were used to institutions that processed them rather than engaged them, who had learned to be absent in the particular way you learn to be absent when presence had repeatedly been unrewarded. Darius did not process them. He showed them things. He showed them how an engine told you what was wrong with it if you were willing to listen to what it was saying. He showed them the patience of discipline. Lots of a prom that required 15 failed attempts before the 16th one worked, and how you stayed with it, and what it felt like when it finally gave. He showed them that the hands knew things the head hadn't caught up to yet, and that trusting the hands was a skill, and that the skill was transferable to things that had nothing to do with engines. He didn't lecture. He worked next to them. That was the whole method. And it was not a method he'd designed, it was simply how he'd learned. How Breslin had once worked with him. How the best people he'd ever been around had passed things on. Not from above. From alongside. Word got out the way things got out in small towns, which was quickly and imprecisely. By the 5th week, there were people coming by the building who had nothing to do with Carr's parents. Mostly, who'd heard something and wanted to see if it was true. Who stood in the doorway the way Marcus had stood. Darius let them watch. He didn't perform for them. If they came in and asked a real question, he answered it. If they brought their kid back the next day, he worked with the kid. Victor came by twice a week, usually in the evenings. He didn't interfere with operations, he'd been precise about that. Had told Darius on the first day that his role was to support and his expectation was to stay out of the way. He kept that promise. He came in, talked to Carla, asked Darius how things were going, and mostly just stood and watched the floor, with the expression of a man whose investment was paying returns he hadn't dared count on. On the 7th week, he sat down next to Darius at the workbench at the end of a day and said, "You know what this is." "A garage," Darius said. "Don't be modest. It's the wrong thing to be modest about." Victor looked at the floor swept clean. Tools hung properly, the specific order that Darius had established, and that the apprentices maintained because they understood it was part of what they were learning. Not an arbitrary rule. This is what that building was always supposed to be. Whatever it was before. Whatever it was in between. This is what it was waiting for. Darius said nothing for a moment. "Talk to me about the funding going into month 3, he said. Victor smiled. The grants came through. Both of them. Carla's paperwork was apparently exceptional. A pause. Agnes is satisfied with the outcome reports. "I know," Darius said. "She called me." Victor raised an eyebrow. Agnes calling directly was apparently not common. "She told me," Darius said, "that Colonel Breslin would have found a reason to show up here personally and pretend it was coincidental." Victor laughed. "The real kind, not a polished version." "He absolutely would have," he said. It was the end of the 7th week when the thing happened that Darius had been told to expect, but hadn't entirely prepared himself for. He was locking up. Alone Carla had left at 5, Calvin at 5:30, Marcus and the other apprentices by 6. It was just past 6:30, and the October dark came early now. The same early dark as the afternoon on Route 9. Same chill. Same quality of sky. He heard the door. He turned. Trent Walker was standing in the entrance to the garage. Not the Trent Walker of the parking lot that version had been performing. Had been the assembled costume of a man who was trying to be something he'd constructed out of whatever he had available. This version was different. Smaller. Somehow without the 6 men around him. Older looking, in the way stress aged people when they stopped having the energy to hide it. He was wearing regular clothes jeans, a gray sweatshirt, and he was standing in the doorway with the particular posture of someone who has rehearsed an entrance and then forgotten it when the moment arrived. Darius looked at him. He felt nothing specific at first. Not anger that had never been in the original reaction, which was something that still surprised people when he told them. Not apprehension, something more like recognition. The recognition of seeing the thing Agnes had told him to expect, and finding that its arrival, now that it was here, clarified something rather than complicated it. "The shop's closed," Darius said, neutral. "I know." Trent didn't move. "I wasn't coming for the shop." "What were you coming for?" A long pause. "I drove past here a few times," Trent said. "Last few weeks I kept not stopping." He looked at the floor. "I don't really know what to say." "Then don't say anything complicated," Darius said. "Say the simple thing." Trent looked up. "I'm sorry," he said. "For the parking lot." "For," he stopped. Restarted, for all of it. For how that man ended up on the ground. For what we took from him. "For," he stopped again. Darius waited. "I don't know how to." Trent's voice had something in it that Darius recognized. The particular friction of a man trying to say something true that he'd never said since that form before, that had no established groove to run in. I've been doing things like that for a long time. Intimidating people. Taking things. Feeling like it made me something. He paused. You stopped it in 8 seconds. 8 seconds and I was on the ground. And I've been thinking about those 8 seconds since it happened. And the thing I keep coming back to is you weren't even angry. Darius said nothing. Why weren't you angry? Trent said. I would have been angry. Darius thought about how to answer that. Anger is for when you don't know what to do, he said finally. I knew what to do. Trent absorbed that. How? He said. Because I'd done it before, Darius said. In harder places than a gas station parking lot. And the thing you learn, doing it enough times, is that the point is never the other person. The point is the person on the ground who needs you to be clear. Trent was very still. I've never been the person on the ground, he said. I mean, he caught himself. I've always made sure to be the other person. Because being on the ground is terrifying, Darius said. Trent nodded. You were on the ground in that parking lot, Darius said. Not physically. But you were. Every person who lives the way you were living is on the ground in the way that counts. They've just found a way to keep moving that makes it look like standing up. The silence in the building was total. Trent Walker, 28 years old, was standing in a garage on Mill Street with his hands in the pockets of a gray sweatshirt. And something was happening on his face that didn't have a clean name, but that Darius had seen before, in different contexts, when something in a person shifted on its foundation. When a belief they'd organized their whole life around cracked enough to let something else through. It was not a comfortable thing to witness. It was the most important thing that could happen to a person. I don't know what I want, Trent said. From being here. I didn't come with a plan. I just kept driving past. And then tonight I stopped. Darius walked to the back of the shop. He came back with a broom. He held it out. Trent looked at it. Floor needs to be swept, Darius said. Front to back. Corners first. The way the dirt settles against walls and you have to go after it directly. Takes about 20 minutes if you do it right. Trent looked at the broom. Then at Darius. That's it, he said. That's it, Darius said. You want to be here tomorrow. Come at 8. You want to learn something real. Stay. You want to leave after the floor's swept. That's fine too. No conditions. No debt. You start where you are. Trent took the broom. He started at the front. Darius went back to locking up the tool chest. He worked quietly. And Trent swept quietly, and for 20 minutes, the only sounds were the broom on the concrete, and the click of locks, and the settling of a building at the end of a day. When Trent finished, he brought the broom back. He looked at Darius. I'll be here at 8, he said. Okay, Darius said. Trent left. Darius stood alone in the building for a moment. He thought about Agnes saying, what you do then will be as important as everything else. He thought about how he'd heard that and understood it intellectually. As a correct observation, without fully feeling the weight of it until right now, until standing here with the broom back on its hook, and the door closed, and the knowledge that something had just happened in this room that was going to matter in ways he couldn't entirely predict. He thought about Claire. She will learn more from what you do than what you say. He'd thought about that sentence in the parking lot on Route 9, on the worst Tuesday of Trent Walker's life, and one of the most significant of his own. He'd thought about it in the context of Lily. But it applied. He understood now, more broadly than one daughter. It applied to every person who watched what a man did in the moment when doing nothing would have been easier. Trent Walker had watched what Darius did. And here he was. He locked up and drove home. The day the 50 Hells Angels came to Mill Street was a Saturday in late November. Darius heard them before he saw them. The way he always heard things first, the way that had started as training and had become instinct, and was now just the way his senses were organized. He was on the floor with Calvin and 3 of the apprentices, working through a transmission issue on an F-150 that belonged to a single mother named Diane, who couldn't afford the dealer quote. When the sound arrived, not one motorcycle, not 3, but something that built from a distance into a presence that filled the street. Marcus, the 17-year-old, went to the bay door and looked out. Mr. Cole, he said. His voice had a quality in it that made Darius put down his wrench. He walked to the door. 50 motorcycles lined up along Mill Street in both directions, engines cutting one by one until the silence was sudden and complete, riders dismounting. The particular, unhurried movement of people who had arrived somewhere intentionally and were not rushing the moment. Victor was at the front. Next to him was Stockade. Next to Stockade was Marlene, and behind them, in a line that stretched back to the end of the block, were men and women in patched leather, some old, some not, all bearing the specific quality of people who had decided that this was worth being present for. Darius walked out. The apprentices came out behind him, instinctively. Calvin came out. Carla, who'd been inside on a weekend because Carla was always inside on weekends, came to the door and stopped. Victor walked forward. He stopped 6 feet from Darius. He looked at him for a moment without speaking, the way he'd looked in the parking lot before saying, "Who the hell are you?" But this version of the look was different. Was the look of a man who now knew the answer to that question completely and was taking a second to acknowledge the fullness of it. Then he reached up and removed his jacket. Not theatrically. Slowly, deliberately, the way you removed something that meant something when you were doing it in front of people, for whom it meant the same thing. Behind him, Stockade did the same, then Marlene, then one by one. In a ripple that moved down the line of 50 people, every rider removed their jacket and held it. The street was silent. Darius stood in front of his garage and looked at this, and felt something move through him that he was not entirely prepared for. Not because he didn't understand what it meant. He understood it completely. Understood it in the particular language of people who expressed respect through action rather than declaration. But because understanding it intellectually and experiencing it physically, in your chest, in the specific place where things hit when they're real, were entirely different things. He kept his face level. His eyes were not entirely level. That was the honest account of it. Victor spoke. "This man," he said, not loudly, but clearly into the silence that 50 people had made space for, stood alone when everyone else walked away. He didn't protect me because I was important. He didn't do it because anyone was watching. He did it because someone was on the ground who needed him to be clear. He paused. We've been watching what he built since then. We've been watching him on this floor. We've been watching what happens to people who come through that door. Another pause. And we came today because this is worth showing up for. He extended his hand. Darius shook it. And then this was the part that undid him more than the jackets. More than the line of 50 people. More than anything Victor had said. Stockade stepped forward with something folded in his hands. Not a jacket. Something smaller. A framed photograph. It was from the parking lot. Someone had taken a photograph on Route 9. And in the photograph, Darius was barely visible. You could see his back, his work shirt, his posture. But the thing the photograph captured was the old man on the ground. And the crowd around him, who had done nothing, and the single figure stepping into the frame. Underneath the photograph, on a small card, were 5 words. The man nobody walked past. He held the frame for a moment. He thought about what he'd wanted to say to Victor in the parking lot. There's not much to know. He thought about all the things that sentence had contained: the deliberate invisibility, the careful smallness, the years of being exactly what he needed to be, for exactly the person who needed him to be it. And nothing more. He'd been about the nothing more. Not about the choice. The choice had been right. Lily had gotten the father she needed, and he had gotten the life that made him someone worth having here. Now, on this floor, doing this thing, but wrong about the cost of it. He'd thought that choosing the quiet life meant giving something up permanently, that the man he'd been was a closed account, a prior version, filed away. He'd carried that belief for 6 years and managed it so completely that he'd stopped feeling it as a loss and started feeling it as a fact. Agnes had been the one to name what it actually was. You didn't give it up, she'd said. That night in her study, you invested it. You put it somewhere safe and let it grow. And what you built in that quiet life, the patience, the presence, the specific capacity to stand in a room with a young man who has nothing going for him and give him 20 minutes of your real attention, that's not in spite of what you were before. That's because of it. Everything you learned in the hard places came with you. It just needed a different expression. He held the photograph. He said, Thank you. He said it to Victor, and to the 50 people on the street, and to all of it, the whole architecture of the thing. Agnes and Breslin and Stockade's flatbed and Marcus in the doorway, and Trent with the broom and Raymond showing up on 3 Saturdays with his tools without saying a word about it. Thank you for seeing it, for waiting, for building the door and letting him decide when to open it. Then he did something nobody expected. He turned to Marcus, who was standing at his shoulder. Come here, he said. Marcus came forward. Darius handed him the photograph. Marcus looked at it, looked at Darius, didn't fully understand. That goes inside, Darius said. On the wall, by the door. He looked at Marcus steadily, because every person who comes through that door should know what this place is about. Not about me, about that. He pointed to the figure in the photograph, barely visible, stepping into the frame. About the decision, about the moment when you see someone on the ground and you decide who you're going to be about it. Marcus held the photograph carefully with both hands. Yes, sir, he said. He went inside. Darius turned back to the street. The next several hours were not quiet. Victor's people didn't stand in formation, they were people, fully and specifically, and they dispersed into the garage and the conversation and the afternoon with the ease of people who were genuinely present rather than performing presence. Some of them talked to the apprentices. Some of them looked at the equipment and asked real questions about the work. An older man named Hector, who turned out to have run a machine shop in Albuquerque for 20 years, spent 45 minutes with Calvin, going through the transmission job on the F-150. And by the time they were done, Diane's truck was finished, and Calvin had learned 2 things he hadn't known before. This was, Darius thought, exactly what it was supposed to look like. Not ceremony, not gesture. People with skills and knowledge moving alongside people who needed skills and knowledge. And the transfer happening, in the natural way, it happened person to person, hand to hand, in the real language of work. Lily arrived at 3:30. He'd called Denise that morning and told her what was happening, and Denise had offered to keep Lily until things settled down, and he'd said, actually, I want her here. He'd thought about it specifically and decided it deliberately. Denise dropped her at the corner, and Lily walked up the street alone, past the motorcycles, looking at them with the focused attention she brought to things she found genuinely interesting. She was not intimidated, she was, as far as Darius could tell, cataloging. She found him inside. She stood next to him and looked at the room, Calvin and Hector on the truck, Marcus hanging the photograph, Carla talking to Marlene with the energy of 2 people who had just discovered they had a lot to say to each other. Apprentices in conversation with riders. Victor standing near the bay door, looking at all of it, with the expression of a man who has built something and is standing inside it. Is this the something? Lily said. Yeah, he said. This is the something. She looked around for a long moment. It's exactly right, she said. He put his hand on her shoulder. She leaned against him, the way she'd been leaning against him since she was small enough to reach only his elbow. He felt her weight there, familiar and specific and irreplaceable, and he looked at the room, at the people in it, the work happening in it, the photograph going up on the wall by the door, and he let himself feel it completely, not manage it, not contain it, feel it. This was what the quiet life had been building toward, not a destination he could have named or planned. Something that had been assembled, piece by piece, from Tuesday spaghetti and before sunrise lunches and book chapters, read in the dark, and thousands of mornings, where he woke up and chose the right thing, before the day had asked anything of him yet. The heroes aren't built in the moment, Agnes had said. The heroes are built in the mornings. He'd been building this for 6 years without knowing it. Every morning that he chose presence over absence, every afternoon that he showed someone something real, every night that he sat in the hallway and listened to his daughter breathe herself to sleep. All of it had been the construction of this. The parking lot was 8 seconds. The garage was 6 years. The garage was the real story. 3 months later, Darius was at his workbench on a Friday morning when Trent Walker appeared beside him. Trent had been there every day at 8 since the night with the broom. He'd started on the floor sweeping, cleaning, the ground-level work that most people considered beneath them and that Darius had always believed told you everything you needed to know about a person's actual relationship with work. Then, After 3 weeks, Darius had started showing him things. Small things first. Basic maintenance. The language of engines. The patience of listening to what something was telling you about what was wrong. Trent was not a natural mechanic. He was, however, a committed one. And committed, Darius had learned, beat natural every time over the long run. That Friday morning, Trent stood beside him and watched him work for a moment. Then he said, "Can I ask you something?" "You're going to anyway," Darius said. The corner of Trent's mouth moved. It was the first time Darius had seen anything approaching a smile on that face. "The night I came in," Trent said, "with the broom. You weren't surprised." "No," Darius said. "You expected me. I'd been told you'd come." Trent absorbed that. "By who?" Darius set down his wrench. He looked at Trent. "By someone who'd looked at your history and decided you weren't finished," he said. "The same way someone once looked at mine and decided the same thing." Trent was very still. "Someone believed that about me," he said. Not as a statement. As something he was trying to make real by saying it aloud. "Yes," Darius said. "Before you showed up, before the broom, before any of it." He paused. "The only question was whether you were going to make them right." Trent looked at the floor. "Am I?" he said. "Ask me in 5 years," Darius said. He picked up the wrench. "Get back to that brake line." Trent went back to the brake line, and Darius went back to work. Outside, on Mill Street, the garage sign was visible from 2 blocks in either direction, simple, clear, without ornamentation. Inside, on the wall by the door, the photograph hung where Marcus had put it. The figure in the frame, stepping forward, barely visible in the background of someone else's worst moment. The man. Nobody walked past. People still told the story of the parking lot. They'd probably always tell it. It had the shape of things that became permanent. That got passed from person to person, not because they were extraordinary in the way movies were extraordinary, but because they were true in the way that real things were true, which was completely and without decoration. Darius always listened when someone told it, and he never corrected the 8 seconds. He just let it stand. Because the 8 seconds were true. They were just not the whole truth. The whole truth was a 10-year-old girl with clay on her hand, and her mother's eyes who asked the right question every night before she went to sleep. The whole truth was Raymond Hayes showing up on 3 Saturdays with his tools and not saying a word about it. The whole truth was Marcus in the doorway, deciding to stay. Trent at the brake line, deciding to try. Calvin's hands, already knowing. Carla's paperwork precise as meticulous. Agnes at her desk, carrying a name on a list. Victor with his hand extended 1 beat too long. Breslin, long ago and far away, looking at a 26-year-old and deciding he was worth watching. The whole truth was every morning before the day asked anything. Every lunch packed before sunrise. Every right thing done when nobody was watching. Because that was where heroes were actually built. Not in the parking lot. Not in the 8 seconds. In the thousands of ordinary mornings that made those 8 seconds possible, that filled a man with enough of the right that, when the moment came, he didn't have to think about it. He just stepped forward. And the whole story, every part of it, the quiet years, and the loud afternoon, and the building, and the broom, and the photograph on the wall came down, finally, to the simplest thing. A man who kept choosing right when it would have been easier not to. And a life that became, because of it, the kind of life that made a difference. That was all. That was enough. That was everything.